What if ransomware didn't start with criminals, but with curiosity? What if the first hackers weren't villains in hoodies, but outsiders looking for connection? And what if the internet wasn't designed to be insecure, but designed to be open? Today, we're tracing how playful exploration became professionalized extortion and how a handful of missing puzzle pieces turned ransomware into a global industry. Today's guest is Anja Shortland, a professor of political economy at King's College London, here to talk about her latest book, Dark Screens. I'm Autumn Phaneuf, and I'm joined by my co-host, Noah Giansiracusa, and this is Breaking Mouth.
All right. So, Anya, let's get started right at the beginning. What is ransomware and when did it really start becoming an issue?
Ransomware is malware that locks up people's data, encrypts them, and makes the victim dependent on the perpetrator to restore the data to full functioning. It sometimes comes with an element of data theft, data exfiltration, and the threat of publishing that data on the darknet or in the press. So there are various forms of ransomware, but the point is it creates the opportunity for an extortion relationship between a ransomware gang and a company or an individual or a charity or a government.
Now, walk us through one of the ransomware attacks that was detailed in your book. What exactly happened? Who was involved? And how was it resolved?
So there are many types of ransomware attack. Some of them are run by individuals. A lot of them are run by ransomware gangs, and very occasionally they're run by governments. Sometimes they're really targeted at a particular government or a particular hospital or a particular sector. Sometimes they're completely indiscriminate. They're using worms to crawl from one computer to another, and they can completely paralyze entire economies. So I call that ransom war rather than ransomware. So we've seen that emanating from Russia once and from North Korea once. The point is that at some stage, access is found into a system, whether that is a hospital or a university or a company. And once it's in the system, it will try and corrupt as much as possible, so that when the victim realizes there's something going on in their system and they want to shut it down, the perpetrators have already exfiltrated a lot of very sensitive data and can just flick a switch and encrypt most of it. So there are lots of attacks that are detailed there. The earliest attacks were not particularly sophisticated, and they were not particularly expensive to resolve. They were asking for $200, for $300. But they caused a lot of destruction and problems for the people involved. So coming back to Noah's first question, when did this really start? It started in 2013, CryptoLocker attacks. And it was a mass attack. Lots and lots of companies got encrypted, but each of them was only supposed to pay a very small amount of money. But one of the places that's particularly susceptible to ransomware is the healthcare sector. So it's we very often see that the weakest in society, people who are waiting for operations or for a scan or to have their prescription medicine released, are the ones that really suffer from this kind of attack, when an entire hospital has to go into pen and paper mode because absolutely nothing works anymore.
So, one of the things I found the most fascinating, but also kind of beguiling when I was reading your book, is this dynamic where the perpetrators, in a way, they're criminals, but in a way, they're business entrepreneurs. And in many of your examples, it seemed like they didn't actually want to hurt the victims. So you mentioned these people at hospitals and things. it seemed almost like the bad guys, if you want to call them that, they didn't want to be bad. They just knew they could make money. And some of them are from countries where there are not a lot of options for making money. So how did you think about this as you're learning about this, researching it, and especially writing it? This fact that in a way, the bad guys are sometimes good, the good guys are sometimes bad. To me, it was very complicated in a fascinating way.
I teach economics of crime, and the question of what is crime is very central to a lot of my thinking. So here we have these internet startups whose business is morally questionable. I mean, they're stealing, they're taking hostage, they're extorting. But for most of them, where they sit, which means in Russia, what they're doing is not a crime, because what they're doing is wreaking havoc in enemy territory, and therefore they are sheltered by their governments. So what they're doing is a crime as far as the victim is concerned, but as far as their own country is concerned, it's not a crime. And one of my colleagues, Max Smeets, is saying, well, it just looks like a really badly run internet startup. And I said, Max, that's exactly what it is. Where they're located, it's not a crime. And then that often raises the question, well, what is the morality around these enterprises? Yeah, they're working things out for themselves. So there was a sick kids hospital in Toronto that was attacked by one of these ransomware groups, and they said, sorry, we didn't mean to do that. This was Lockbit, and they said, we're sacking the person who's responsible for it. Turned out that they didn't. But they do have to work out to some extent who they are, how they position themselves. They don't want to get onto the list of sanctioned enterprises either, because once they're a terrorist organization, then that makes business very difficult for them. One group that had encrypted Assyrian father's pictures of the children he'd lost in the war. And they also stepped back from that and said, no, this is not what we wanted to do. But obviously the NHS and Synovus and airports and manufacturing and Marks and Spencers and the Co-op, that's all fair game.
So you brought us to
Interesting business model.
You brought us to 2013 as the beginning of these real ransomware attacks, but your book starts much earlier. So let's go back to almost the prehistory, and touching on the same theme of your last comment. It really seems like you start with hackers, and hackers in the early days were almost these glorified heroes. So I'd like to hear a little bit about the hackers that initiated this whole movement. And also, I think, Autumn, when we were discussing, you brought up an interesting point, which is a lot of academia and academic research kind of laid the foundations for what happened. So I'd like to hear about both of those.
Yes, I was really interested by the very early days of the internet. Both by the groups of people who were so fascinated and committed to the idea of open communication, or frictionless communication. And the sort of social misfit, the slightly odd people, the real enthusiasts, the one with the ADHD energy who were just really getting into this amazing playground where everyone was allowed to build something, tear somebody else's stuff down, use it for something else. The sort of sharing space where the word hacker just was somebody who was good at enthusiastically building something new, getting into somebody else's area, trespassing, getting a trophy. A really interesting anarchic space. And two of the hackers that I feature in my book are Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, because they were so proud of being hackers. And they knew what they were doing was illegal. But on the other hand, it was just a huge amount of fun.
So could you fill our listeners in? What were they doing that was illegal?
So they were building themselves was called a little blue box. And this is a device that you could use to cheat public telephone companies out of their fees by making the right noises in front of a receiver without pressing the button. So each button had a specific frequency associated with it. And it was the frequencies that were responded to by the system to place the call. But the charging system required you to touch the buttons. So if you could make the right frequency, if you could whistle or sing them or have a synthesizer that produced them, you could make free phone calls. And this was just a fantastic technical challenge for Steve Wozniak. It was something where they had to sneak into a library where they're not supposed to be and find the right frequencies from this code book. They were so elated when they found out that they might be able to build this. And then their analog generators weren't good enough. So it took them a while to build this little blue box, but then they could build it multiple times. They started selling this blue box to the people in their dorm at university. And it's just such a joyful story about people learning to control hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment with something that they could build for $100. They're really, really proud of it. But they're also really relying on their white and class privilege to get away with it, in the sense that they are found by the police in a phone box with their little blue box, and they're just led off. They just have talked themselves out of it. So, oh, it's a badly out of tune music synthesizer, weren't really doing anything. And they were sort of waved home because they're nice white middle class boys. And that's not the experience that other people had. So if you're working class and if you're slightly odd, then that might not go nearly as well. And the telephone companies are really pushing back against these young people who were just mischief makers, but there was this sort of moral panic about what they were doing. And so you could really go to prison for a long time for this kind of playfulness. But who did and who didn't, it was really often a race and class thing. So I always find that fascinating about how we conceive crime and who is a criminal. But then, of course, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak eventually grow out of their hacking days and they start to fence in what are effectively the commons, this anarchic space, and say, well, but if you want to play with our computer and we want to play with our software, you need to buy it. And that completely changes this space. And I'm sort of thinking that cybercrime is just the other side of the medal of the cyber wealth. And a lot of it seems rather arbitrary as to who ended up on which line of the boundary, and not terribly fair either. So I have a bit of a heart for the misfits that ended up on the wrong side of the divide here. And at the very least I can do in my book is just to see the world from their point of view, put myself in their shoes and say, well, what does it look like if I'm in Chelyabinsk and everything is grey and I'm not going to see an orange in my lifetime? What does the American dream look like? How can I get there? How can I get at least a taste of a Californian life?
Now, if you're thinking about this from the other side, what happened after the attacks? How are we even approaching ransomware attacks? And how are we essentially preventing this?
So the reason I've written the book was to engage the average computer user with cybersecurity, because I feel that a lot of us don't have the language to engage in the debate. We feel powerless. We feel that this is something that we want to outsource. And that's not working. outsourcing cybersecurity does not work because we as the users are very often the weak point in the system. So a lot of attacks come through social engineering. So I want to tell the stories of what happened and tell the stories of the mistakes that people have made, and help people to think about, well, what would be a good cybersecurity stance for me? What do I want to do? How safe do I need to be? I don't want to be perfectly safe because that's going to be really, really lonely because I'm not going to be reachable. There's a trade-off there. But okay, so I may be breached, but do I have a photo album, or do I absolutely rely on somebody else to decode all of my lifetime memories? So how resilient am I? Yes, I think governments can do more. I think companies will have to keep engaging in this arms race with attackers. But what I'm really hoping for is that individuals are thinking, well, this is something that I can engage with, where I can make good choices. I don't have to wait for someone to impose choices on me. Because I understand, and if some computer security expert spouts jargon at me, I'm going to understand. Or I'm going to understand 70% of it, and that will give me enough confidence to ask what he's actually saying. Like, can you say that in English, please?
So you mentioned arms race, and one thing that I think is especially fascinating about this whole story is there's not just the arms race of the attackers are getting more sophisticated and the response, the defense, if you want to call it, is getting more sophisticated. There's also this larger dynamic that we are putting more of our lives online in the internet. We're more exposed because everything we do, like right now, we are meeting online, we're recording this online, I do some of my teaching, our banking is online. So we've created a world where so much of everything we do is susceptible to hacking, whereas maybe 30 years ago is very different. But what I want to highlight here is we are a math podcast, so let's get a little nerdy. This world we've created that's, so internet connected, where we have these attackers and defenders and everyone's getting more sophisticated, so much of that is powered by math. So can you mention for our listeners, some of the mathy topics that come up? I think it'll just be fun to hear the range and the variety that this is not a story about math, and yet it's a story that's in a way driven by math.
Oh, absolutely. And for any of this to be possible, there were massive innovations required. So my first ransomware attack is in 1989, where somebody decides that they want to teach people a lesson about AIDS by sending them a diskette on some AIDS-related topic and say, don't put this in your computer. It will cease to function normally and you'll owe me some money if you put it in. And then people put it into their computer anyway. So it's this parable on AIDS, like, don't put it unless you know where it's been.
Amazing.
So it's a kind of hacker type practical joke, but it encrypts people's disk drives, and he offers them a remedy for this virus. But it's obviously extremely cumbersome to deliver your ransomware with a diskette that you have to print and then put in an envelope and lick the envelope and post. So this is really expensive. And secondly, it was relatively easy to decrypt. So the encryption technology wasn't that great. And the third thing was that once you'd decrypted it once, you could share the decryption code across everyone who'd been affected. So clearly that wasn't a great business model. And the last part of the business model that didn't quite work as intended was that people were supposed to send a postal order to a PO box in Panama, which unfortunately had just got invaded by the United States, and therefore the sort of payments process was problematic. So Noah's asking, well, what do you need to do? Well, first of all, you need to create an internet in which code can be easily shared, where people end up downloading stuff that they don't quite mean to. So how do you connect computers? How do you create that connectivity? So a whole set of innovation around making computers talk to each other, and preferably use one language rather than having lots of modems that try and put things together and translate from one to the other. So that was number one. Then there is, well, how do you encrypt things so that it's not that easy to decrypt? So a whole academic field of cryptology. And then the question of, can you make that cryptology such that you create a new set of code for everyone that you attack and still not quite lose track of whose computer's been encrypted by which program, because otherwise you don't have a business model.
Is this asymmetric encryption?
That is asymmetric encryption. Yes.
Let's zoom in on that just to get one
Yeah, we can
nitty gritty detail. What does that look like in practice?
So what asymmetric encryption does is you create a new program for encryption for each new victim. And the only thing that you leave on the victim's computer is a piece of code that says where to find the code. So you can match up the two. But there is nothing that's left on the victim's computer that allows them to reverse engineer the encryption profile. So we're using this all the time for our banking transaction. And said the final, the really important bit of the ransomware puzzle was the payments mechanism. And that was only resolved with cryptocurrencies, which also relies very heavily on asymmetric. And so asymmetric encryption is something that we're not that familiar thinking about, but we're using it all the time to safely communicate with each other on the through.
Let me jump into the crypto stuff. When we're looking at encryption with security transactions, let's just dive right into Bitcoin. You open up your phone, you'll have your wallet, you go in. Sometimes it's your first password. If you forget your password, you have more of like a security key. Then it shows you your account. But sometimes those are 12 to 16 words. You want to talk about some of that tipping point on what goes on behind the scenes with Bitcoin, whether that's pseudonym payments or liquidity in ATMs, or how exactly do we avoid governments watching us and our transactions?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are really problematic because they are so tailor-made
Of
for
course.
criminal transactions. Ransomware only came once you had the pseudonymous process for taking payments.
Wait, can I just make sure I'm understanding? So you're saying that cryptocurrency like Bitcoin really is kind of at the heart of enabling ransomware?
Yes.
Interesting.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I don't like cryptocurrencies at all because of that. But I can see what Autumn is saying, and in my final chapter, I reflect on that because there's this trade-off between freedom and safety, regulation. Yeah, what is the right mix there? Should people have access to something that is so tailor-made for crime? To what extent do you want to regulate that? Do you want to regulate it out of its existence? Do you want to regulate it so it's going to be much more difficult to use it for crime? But of course, it's now something that quite a lot of very powerful people hold a lot of, which makes regulation very unlikely.
So let's shift gears for a second, but stick to mathiness in general. But another aspect of math that I don't remember if it was actually named in your book, but it certainly felt like a theme, let's say, game theory, which I really just mean negotiations, like very complicated strategic negotiations. So I'd love if you could kind of walk through some of the negotiations and the calculations that come up. And I'll just give a hint at what I have in mind. Things like, should people pay the hackers? Like if someone takes over your system, should you pay them or should you call the government? What goes into that calculation? Should the government tell people that you're not allowed to pay hackers? Should they let them? So if you can just walk through some of these very fascinating calculations, I really was drawn to that part of the book.
So people always have a choice, but sometimes the choices are very stark. So you have all of your data locked up. You have a company that is hemorrhaging money while you don't have access to your computer. You might have patients dying on the ward. You might have milk going stale in your stores. You might have all of the eastern seaboard of the US waiting for fuel. So there is a question of what is the cost of business interruption? Then there is a question of how long would it take me to recover on my own? Can I recover on my own? Do I have any faith in the ability and willingness of the attacker to help me out here? Just because somebody's encrypted something doesn't necessarily mean that they can decrypt it. One of the wonderful puzzles I find as an economist of crime is that we have branded crime. I've never seen sort of single estate cocaine being marketed under a Coca-Cola brand kind of thing, or cocaine cola. But here we have Lockbit, CryptoLocker, Killing. They all have names, and they all have trying to build reputations in cyberspace. You find this whole infrastructure around creating credibility and reputation for brands. When you are hacked, engage in a conversation, or before you engage in a conversation with your attacker, you can check whether two randomly selected files can be decrypted. So you check for proof of life and proof of possession before you do anything. And it's only then that you decide, well, we might want to at least open up a channel of communication with a ransomware gang. It doesn't mean that you don't have a parallel track in which you try and recover. But if that hits the bumpers, then at least you also have this negotiation track ongoing at the same time. And then, of course, as an economist, I must be interested in prices. So what's a fair price for unlocking a company that is struggling, that is facing potentially a very long downtime? But also, if there has been a data breach, they're facing the possibility that the regulator will punish them for losing their customer or their patient or their student or their donor data. Data privacy is a major issue. And then you need to think about, okay, they're extorting me on this data privacy issue as much as they're extorting me on the decryption. I might not need the decryption, but I might want them to reassure me that they're not selling this data. But then can I trust them that they haven't sold it already? Can I trust them that they haven't kept a copy?
So you make it
So
almost
so many things. This is not a neat 2x2 game theory thing. There's so much that's going into it. But what is nice is that the ransomware gangs are aware that all of this is going on in people's minds. And they say, well, we can reassure you on this. And we've got this leak website. And this is where we're putting all of our victims' names. And if you engage with us, then we blur out your name. We're not going to publish your name. So that has some value. They might publish your name, but we're not going to publish your data. We're going to have a countdown timer. So they're really putting on the pressure. And then they have a list and the data of everyone that they've breached before who haven't engaged with them. Yeah, to make the threat credible. Because there isn't such a thing as as a little bit of a data leak. Yeah, so the regulator will react to the tiniest bit of data leak. So they don't want to destroy the value. So they say, okay, well, this is what we've done to others that haven't engaged with us. So yes, there's lots of games and sub games going on. What makes these ransom negotiations so interesting is that the perpetrators often have spent a number of days, weeks, if not months in your system, and they know your profit and loss account. They know your turnover. They know your business's problems as well as you do. So if you say, "How I couldn't possibly afford this," they say, "Well, yes, you can."
So it seems as if it's settlement as a service, but you made one note in the book that I saw. It's if paying is rational for individuals, it's irrational for the system.
Indeed. Yeah. So this is my third book on extortive crimes. I've written on kidnap for ransom and I've written on art recovery. And those are both very different because you have a huge amount of ransom discipline. So people will take a lot of pain, or companies will take a lot of pain. They'll take a lot of time to negotiate low ransoms with kidnappers, pirates, rebel groups, etc. Because they know that if kidnapping for ransom is profitable, then we'll see a lot of it. And every big ransom paints a bullseye target on everybody else who is in that complex and hostile environment, whether that's the Colombian jungle or a gold mines in Mali or companies in the Niger Delta. So if you have a system in which a small number of companies have all the problems, and in this case, it's kidnap for ransom insurers, their approach to that kind of problem of our chief engineer is missing and somebody wants $1 million for him, and we know that if we pay them $1 million, then we're never going to be safe here again. Let's barter it down to 30,000.
Sure.
It's something that's bad for the chief engineer, possibly. Yeah, it'll take a while. It might take a while longer than just throwing money at the problem. But ultimately, it keeps this thing insurable. But if you have something that's just a series of one-off interaction where people say, well, I need to solve my problem now. My company is hemorrhaging funds. My patients are dying on the ward. It's something that will resolve as fast as possible. If the ransom is affordable, if they've pitched it at a point where you say, I just want this to go away, then there isn't anybody who says, but you can't, or you shouldn't, or give it 3 days. And also, you can hold the data for as long as you like. There isn't an equivalent level of pain that you can impose on a ransomware gang as you could impose on a kidnapper who's bartering from the back of a car or with somebody in his grandpa's shed. They want to get rid of the hostage. You can keep a terabyte data, no problem. It costs you a little, but there isn't. Often people think, oh, well, let's just have a ransom ban. Yeah, let's just not pay. Let's not let anybody pay any ransoms. And that will end ransomware because, after all, it's motivated mostly by profit. But it's really, really hard to make that credible because the perpetrators will go for the weakest targets, which is going to be healthcare, which is going to be critical infrastructure. I don't know how many police stations in the US have been locked up with ransomware.
So a lot of your book is the story of the history of ransomware, starting with the hacker early days, as we talked about, the early ransomware attacks, the developing ones, the way that it's sometimes a business proposition, it's sometimes a nationalistic military dynamic. So it's this whole story that's really fascinating. but it really kind of leaves the reader almost in a cliffhanger thinking, what happens now that AI is coming in? Certainly, the attacker's tools are going to get much stronger. The defender's tools will get much stronger. So do you have a sense of what, if you wrote this book or the sequel 5 or 10 years from now, what stories you'll be telling?
As I said before, the weakest point is often the individual. And it's the phishing, it's the social engineering, and it's the email that promises you something that you really want to open, that you want to click, something that is couched in a language that appeals to you. And that's, I think, where AI can really supercharge the attackers. So, for example, as a professor, I constantly receive emails from people who say, please have a look at my CV. I would like to do a PhD with you. And I have a really fascinating data set. And why don't you have a quick look at this? And you can tell from the language when it's not right. And that's going to be more and more difficult to tell something that's genuine from something that has just been roughly translated from the Russian. And I think that's something that's going to be more and more difficult. People need to be ever more careful, ever more cautious, and things will just slip through. In terms of coding, yes, it's going to make it more accessible. Code me or a Trojan. It's going to lower the barrier to entry. One of the big things in my book is about these ransomware gangs, the way that they have to overcome really serious obstacles to cooperate in cyberspace, have employees and affiliates who they only know by nickname, etc., because there are so many specialized tasks within this ransomware business, coding and pen testing and getting access and negotiating, etc. With AI, that might make it possible to shrink these firms, and that will make them more effective operators. So there are problems on the way, but on the other hand, you can also use AI to look at a system and say, is there something unusual going on in here? Yeah, are we seeing something that ought not to be? So it's not, the advantages are not all on one side. So I think what we're going to see is a continuation of this arms race, of this co-evolution of cyber criminality and cybersecurity. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was the way that people move between them. Now, you might be a really good hacker and cyber criminal, and you do your 3 years in a prison, and then you end up being the star on the other side. So
You never know what will happen.
no. No, I like that I've got these sort of rather fishy superheroes and these rather relatable criminals that then turn up on the other side. And
Sometimes the criminals end up going into hackathons. You don't know what's going to happen. Now, out of curiosity, is there any advice that you would like to give to individuals or organizations to be better protected?
I think organizations are pretty clued up, but it's filtering it down to the employee level. You do need to change your password. You do need to change your password frequently, and it does need to be a sensible password. And you need to look at everything twice. So my way of saying that to people is writing this book and say, yes, you are powerful when it comes to your cybersecurity, but you're also powerful when it comes your resilience to extortive crime. I want people to think about what they can do without, what they need to do so that they don't have to engage with a ransomware gang over their photos, that they do have their most important things on a memory stick, which is not stuck in the back of their computer, that they have sensible backups. It's possible. It's possible to become resilient, and it doesn't take everything, doesn't take every inch of your time or your money. So it's just something to think about. What is a good stance for me? How am I going to be safe enough? How am I going to be resilient enough? But also, what do I expect my politicians to do for me? What can I expect them to do for me? But I am really worried that we have people dying because of ransomware, and we have absolutely minimal government engagement on this. Yes, it is a difficult problem, but I want people to ask questions of their policy and their lawmakers and say, well, what are you practically going to do? And what is our plan when it goes wrong? I don't want to see that on the hoof policy making again that we had in COVID, which was a perfectly predictable thing.
Yep.
Well, we know that ransomware could just take out part of the country, part of our critical infrastructure. We might not have electricity. We might not have water. What's the plan? So, yes, I would like voters to start asking questions about what the plan B is and whether we can rehearse it. What we can all do to make it less likely to succeed, whether it's just yet another cack-handed attempt at ransomware that brings an entire country to its knees. Or what if somebody uses this offensively and seriously and in a coordinated way? It does make me scared that we haven't thought and prepared for it.
If hacking began as a curiosity, ransomware became capitalism. And if the internet began as trust, now it runs on negotiated risk. The question isn't whether ransomware will disappear, it's whether you're willing to pay in money, convenience, or freedom to dial the risk down. So, as always, stay curious, and you might just want to change your password.